Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your sweep union, and in this one there's been some developments in favor of the Russians over the past 8 hours. The Russians have managed to advance in the Donetsk region from the northern to the southern outskirts. They continued offensive operations west of Lyman to secure the supply lines leading into Lyman from across the Oskar River line. At the same time, they have managed to secure the southern outskirts of the Serebryansky first area, pushing the Ukrainians across the border area between the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The Russians also flanking Shakhove from the west, where they're looking to put the Ukrainian forces in a pincer maneuver by flanking them from the eastern and western directions to cut off the supply lines leading into the settlement and cut off the Ukrainian counterattack taking place northeast of Pokrovsk. To the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to capture the settlement of Muravka as they push towards the border of the Dnipropetrovsk region from the Donetsk region. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians have gained full control over Muravka, which is just a small area remaining under Ukrainian control, mainly centered around the hourglass formation. If the Russians are able to gain control over it, they'll be able to start pushing in the direction of Novo from the northeast in combination with their forces to the east and southeast of the settlement, and the offensive operations in the direction of Ivanivka and Filia, as well as the cutting off the Ukrainian counterattack in the direction of Dashne. This means a Russian offensive operation from the east, south, and west. This raises the question as to what is the objective of the Russian forces in the direction of Ivanivka. To answer this question, we have to do a lot of inferences based on the limited information we have. What we do know is that the Russians have secured a foothold in the eastern part of the settlement and that this move comes from across the river line. What we do not know is how did they get there, as there's been no footage of it, just reliable reports of them being present there. That does not give a lot of information. Based on the fact that they've managed to reach Ivanivka, we have to take a look at the terrain to the south of it. There are some forest lines, but they are not dense at all. It is mostly open areas. Then there's the river line itself. What we have seen in the direction of Filia is that the Russian soldiers have moved and swam across the river line to then move into Filia. If it is a similar scenario here, the Russians have likely moved from the Novokhatsk direction through the forest lines here and into the Vovcha River line, swimming across into the forest patches to the east, and then moving into Ivanivka. In that case, there are not a lot of Russian soldiers in the area, but rather a small amount of soldiers. Their main objective at that point would be to do reconnaissance, clear the first buildings of Ukrainian forces, and allow for FPV drones to be more accurate, as they can call on FPV drone support whenever they need it, as well as simply being able to sabotage Ukrainian positions and clear buildings from Ukrainian FPV drone operators. If that is the case, then the Russians' objective with their soldiers within the settlement is to clear the first buildings and secure the landings for additional forces so that when new troops arrive, they are not ambushed by the Ukrainians. In that case, they are to establish a perimeter and clear the way for Russian armored vehicles that have river crossing capabilities to drop off infantry and supplies within the settlement, from where they can start developing offensive operations further. They chose the eastern parts because it is closer to their positions, and also because there's this choke point further west, which means that the Russian objective is likely to either push in the northern flank, gain control over the fortifications, and cut off the road here connecting Ivanivka with the settlement of Novopavlivka to the northeast, cut off the connection between these two settlements and the further connection between the wider area, as there are no additional main roads further north, but this is the main connection. The secondary objective would be to cut off the intersection, which is a choke point here in the eastern parts of the settlement, which will allow the Russians to establish themselves within the eastern part, build up their forces, put up positions and entrenchments within the basements and the buildings, and then develop offensive operations from there towards gain control of the remaining parts of the settlement, the fortified positions on the outskirts, and so on. Therefore, the Russians will slowly be building up their forces, clearing their perimeter, and building up combat potential to gain control over the fortified positions, the choke point, and the eastern parts of the settlement, from which they'll develop further to gain control of the remaining parts of Ivanivka, potentially additional crossings following the capture of Ivanivka and Serebryansky. Gaining control over this area will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations towards Novo from the western flank, which bypasses most of the Ukrainian fortifications in the vicinity of the settlement. There are some trenches in the western parts, but they are overlooking the eastern section, not facing the western direction. That means the Russian forces pushing from the flank will have a significant advantage if they are able to concentrate armored vehicles and a larger concentration of infantry in the area. You'll also be able to cut off the road in the west of Ivanivka, establishing a bridgehead across the Wolf River line and strengthening their combat abilities in the direction of Novo. With the capture of Muravka to the east, they are facing now against the hourglass formation, following which the Russians can do a pincer maneuver from the eastern and western flanks, cutting off the supplies to Novo to gain control over the settlement and establish it as a logistical hub for their forces moving forward in the Dnipropetrovsk region, the eastern parts of it, and again in the direction of Novo to Meshova. The area is largely open fields with barely any fortifications, meaning the Russian forces will be able to strengthen their offensive capabilities and speed up the offensive operations going forward. As for the northeastern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to gain control over this intersection to the northwest of Serebryansky, cutting off an additional supply route to the Ukrainian positions within the settlement. Combined with the recent offensive operations to the east, the Russians may be looking to cut off the supplies to Volodymyrivka by pushing in the direction of Serebryansky from the western, northwestern, and eastern directions to connect and cut off the Volodymyrivka direction, cutting off the main spearhead of the Ukrainian offensive operations to the north of the Russian positions here northeast of Pokrovsk, and to attack the settlement from three directions, giving them the advantage by flanking the fortified positions, establishing a foothold within both banks of the river line, and gaining control over the settlement, which will secure the northern flank of the offensive operations and additional supply lines leading into the frontline positions, such as Kuzyrev Yar, Novo, and Nikanurivka. The Ukrainian offensive operations have been losing steam as there's been no advances by the Ukrainians for the past 3 days, where their main advances have taken place here in the vicinity of Volodymyrivka, but the Russian counterattacks on the flanks indicate that the Russians are complicating the Ukrainian offensive operations. However, if the Ukrainians are able to cut off this final section, then the northwestern and western flanks of the Russian offensive operations will be cut off from supplies, and it will complicate their ability to gain control over the settlement, which will prompt a stronger push from the east or a counterattack from the south, both of which will use up some of the supplies the Russians are dedicating to other offensive operations, such as Rodensky, the defensive operations here to the west, or holding back the Ukrainian forces in the south and in the east. Therefore, the Russians are looking to achieve success with the forces they have available. However, the speed complicates the situation as the Ukrainians have more time to adapt their operations and learn from their mistakes to then gain control of these positions, identify the weak points of the Russians, and cut off a significant portion of their forces. In the direction of the Serebryansky forest area, the Russians have managed to gain control over the southern outskirts, pushing the Ukrainians out of the Siversk River from the northern bank to the southern bank and into the border between the Luhansk and Donetsk region. There is still this small forest patch area which the Russians have yet to clear. However, this likely comes with the offensive operations in the direction of Siversk. As for the job of the Russian forces in the northern bank of the Siversk-Donetsk river line, it will all be redirected to the direction of Yampil as well as Sarishne to gain control over the western bank of the Serebryansky river line and develop offensive operations in the direction of Lyman from the southeast and northeast. The Russian capture of the river line also expands their offensive capabilities in the direction of Siversk. They will have a large concentration of FPV drone operators within the Serebryansky forest area, which can operate within a wide range in the direction of the east of Lyman and the northern parts of Siversk, including the defensive line. This strengthens the Russians' offensive operations and their offensive capabilities in this entire area and allows them to strengthen offensive operations on the northern flank of Siversk. The Russian forces have also been increasing their use of a tactic where few infantry soldiers are able to breach Ukrainian lines and reach deeper, from where they establish themselves in a position where FPV drones then resupply them with food, water, ammunition, and whatever they need. This means the gray zone positions of the Russians here north of Siversk are able to complicate the supply of the forces in the direction of Serebryansky, where the Ukrainians will be forced to use a similar tactic of using FPV drones to resupply their forces, which decreases the defensive and offensive capabilities of their forces in the direction of Serebryansky. This means the Russians can strengthen their offensive operations within Serebryansky to gain control over the positions within the settlement itself. The defensive line of the Ukrainians northeast of Siversk could fall under Russian hands, allowing them to gain control over the remaining parts of the first patch area, clearing the remaining parts of the Serebryansky forest area from Ukrainian forces, and developing offensive operations further on the northern flank of Siversk towards Ivanivka and the supply line of the Ukrainians towards Siversk from the western direction. And with offensive operations in the south, they can cut off the southern highway as well, which would operationally encircle the Ukrainian positions within Siversk. To the northwest of Lyman, the Russians continue offensive operations west of Serebryansky, gaining control over additional forest lines and forest patches along the main road. This is to secure a buffer zone between Serebryansky and the Ukrainian positions. It is unlikely that the Russians will develop offensive operations further westwards as it is right now, as they'll likely be focusing on cutting off the supplies going to Lyman. However, it is also an opportune moment because the Ukrainians may be looking to resupply the forces in the direction of Lyman and dedicate their manpower in that direction to prevent a Russian breakthrough in that direction and strengthen their defensive capabilities around Lyman, which could leave locations such as Novo under-defended and undermanned, which could allow Russian forces to develop offensive operations in that direction to gain control over Kurovy Yar, Vovchi Yar, and Losovo, to then cut off and isolate the Borova section of the Oskil River line from the Lyman section and the Oskil section, strengthening the offensive operations in this direction and creating a position along the Oskil River line to further create an additional pocket similar to the Kupiansk pocket in the direction of Borova, further isolating different sectors of the front line from each other, while the Russians have a stable connection from the eastern flank along the Serebryansky River line as they are gaining control over the entirety of it. The objective of the Russians isn't simply to gain control over these logistical hubs, which will allow them to strengthen offensive operations and strengthen their offensive capabilities, as well as establish defensive lines. It is also to further isolate and separate Ukrainian forces from one sector of the front line to multiple sectors of the front line, limiting the movement and the defensive flexibility of the Ukrainian forces, allowing them to take advantage of their numerical superiority and concentrate their forces in specific sectors of the front line, allowing them to advance in these sectors faster than all the other areas, as the Ukrainians are not able to properly respond to these relocations of forces because they are limited by their manpower shortages. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.